Money makes the world go round, but for some bosses, it's all that matters, no matter the cost. Today we're uncovering the chilling stories of corporate greed, where safety was sacrificed, lives were endangered, and justice came too late for many. Let's dive into the shocking cases of companies like BP and Boeing, who learned the hard way that cutting corners for cash is a dangerous gamble. Our first stop, BP. In 2010, the world watched in horror as the Deepwater Horizon oil rig exploded, causing one of the worst environmental disasters in history. 11 workers lost their lives, and millions of barrels of oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico, devastating ecosystems and local economies. But how did this happen? Investigations revealed a shocking truth. BP's top executives ignored multiple safety warnings to save time and money. Instead of taking precautions, they prioritized profits, even pushing to drill faster despite known risks. The result? Catastrophic failure. BP paid over $20 billion in settlements, but no amount of money could undo the damage. The tragedy highlighted the deadly consequences of greed-driven decisions. Next we turn to Boeing, a name synonymous with aviation excellence until greed sent them into a tailspin. In 2018 and 2019, two Boeing 737 MAX planes crashed, killing 346 people. Why? Because Boeing cut corners, and people paid with their lives. Documents revealed that Boeing rushed the 737 MAX into production to compete with rival Airbus. They ignored engineers' concerns, concealed problems with the plane's MCS software, and skipped critical pilot training, all to save money and secure orders. The fallout was immense. Boeing faced billions in lawsuits, fines, and compensation claims, but the reputational damage was priceless. It took years to rebuild trust, and for many, that trust is still gone. So why do these companies and their bosses ignore safety? The answer is simple: short-term gains. By cutting safety measures, companies save money, increase profits, and impress shareholders. But as BP and Boeing proved, these decisions often lead to long-term losses. Expert voice-over corporate greed creates a culture where employees feel pressured to stay silent about safety concerns. Many fear retaliation or losing their jobs if they speak out. In both cases, whistleblowers and relentless investigations exposed the truth. Employees, engineers, and safety advocates came forward with damning evidence, forcing these companies to face the music. Public outrage and legal action ensured they couldn't sweep their failures under the rug, but justice doesn't always mean accountability. Many executives walked away with hefty bonuses, leaving victims and employees to pick up the pieces. Did BP and Boeing learn their lessons? Both companies claim to have implemented stricter safety measures, but critics argue it's often too little, too late. For many corporations, profits still take priority, and history shows us the cycle of greed is hard to break. The stories of BP and Boeing remind us of the human cost of greed. When bosses care more about their bottom line than safety, everyone suffers. It's up to all of us, workers, consumers, and regulators, to demand better. Because no one's life should be sacrificed for a bigger paycheck. If you believe companies should prioritize safety over profits, make your voice heard. Share this video, subscribe for more insights, and join the fight for accountability. Together, we can make a difference. Somber music fades with text in memory of all lives lost to corporate greed. Gap 2S. The Volkswagen emissions scandal, often referred to as Dieselgate, is yet another stark reminder of the lengths to which corporations will go to maximize profits, even at the expense of the environment and public health. Gap 1S. In 2015 it was revealed that Volkswagen had installed software in over 11 million diesel vehicles worldwide. This software was designed to detect when the car was undergoing emissions testing and temporarily reduce emissions to comply with legal standards. However, under normal driving conditions, these vehicles emitted up to 40 times the legally permissible levels of nitrogen oxides, pollutants linked to respiratory problems and environmental harm. GAP1S. The impact on the environment was devastating. The excess emissions from these vehicles contributed to air pollution, which has been associated with thousands of premature deaths annually. The scandal also undermined public trust in automotive regulations and highlighted the need for stricter oversight and enforcement. GAP1S. The legal consequences for Volkswagen were severe. The company faced billions of dollars in fines, lawsuits, and vehicle recalls. Several high-ranking executives were prosecuted, and the company was forced to implement extensive measures to regain consumer trust and comply with environmental standards. GAP1S. Dieselgate serves as a chilling example of corporate greed and deceit, emphasizing the urgent need for accountability and transparency in all industries. As we reflect on these cases, it becomes clear that the true cost of such scandals is borne not only by the companies involved but by society as a whole. GAP3S. Somber music fades with text, "In memory of all lives lost to corporate greed." GAP2S. The pharmaceutical industry, a sector dedicated to improving health and saving lives, has also faced its own share of scandals where profits were prioritized over patient safety. GAP1S. One of the most glaring examples is the opioid crisis, a public health emergency that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Central to this crisis is Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin. GAP1S. Purdue Pharma aggressively marketed OxyContin, downplaying its addictive potential and pushing it onto doctors and patients as a safe, long-term pain management solution. This led to widespread misuse, addiction, and overdose deaths. The company's deceptive practices fueled an epidemic that continues to devastate communities across the United States. GAP1S. The fallout from the opioid crisis has been catastrophic. Families have been torn apart and public health systems have been overwhelmed. The financial burden on society is immense, with billions spent on healthcare, law enforcement, and rehabilitation. GAP1S. Legal consequences for Purdue Pharma were significant but came too late for many. The company faced numerous lawsuits and eventually filed for bankruptcy. In a landmark settlement, Purdue agreed to pay billions to address the crisis, and members of the Sackler family who own the company were subjected to public scrutiny and legal action. GAP1S. The opioid crisis is a stark reminder of what happens when corporate greed overrides ethical responsibility. It's a sobering lesson that the true cost of such actions is measured not just in dollars but in human lives. GAP3S. Reflective music fades with text, "In memory of all lives lost to corporate greed." GAP2S. In the digital age, data has become one of the most valuable commodities, often referred to as the new oil. However, the tech industry's handling of user data has raised serious ethical and privacy concerns. GAP1S. One of the most notorious examples is the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandal. GAP1S. In 2018, it was revealed that Cambridge Analytica, a political consulting firm, had harvested data from millions of Facebook users without their consent. This data was then used to influence voter behavior in elections around the world, including the 2016 US presidential election. GAP1S. Facebook's role in this scandal was significant. The company failed to protect user data and allowed third-party apps to access personal information without adequate safeguards. This breach of trust exposed the vulnerabilities in Facebook's data privacy policies and sparked a global conversation about the ethical responsibilities of tech companies. GAP1S. The repercussions of this scandal were far-reaching. Facebook faced intense scrutiny from regulators, lawmakers, and the public. The company was fined billions of dollars and had to implement stricter data privacy measures. However, the damage to public trust was profound, and many users questioned the safety of their personal information on social media platforms. GAP1S. The Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandal is a stark reminder of the potential for misuse of personal data in the pursuit of profit. It highlights the need for stronger data protection laws and greater accountability for tech companies. GAP1S. As we continue to navigate the digital landscape, it is crucial to prioritize user privacy and ensure that ethical considerations are not overshadowed by the drive for profit. Gap 3S, reflective music fades with text, in memory of all lives affected by data privacy violations. Gap 3S. The garment industry, the one that brings us all the latest trends so quickly, has a bit of a dark side. Gap 1S. For a long time it's been known for taking advantage of workers in poorer countries. Gap 1S. One of the most awful examples of this is the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh. Gap 1S. Back in April 2013, this 8-story building full of clothing factories just collapsed. Can you imagine? Gap 1S. Over 1,000 workers lost their lives and thousands more were hurt. It was truly heartbreaking. Gap 1S. This tragedy really opened everyone's eyes to the terrible conditions in these factories. Gap 1S. We're talking about dangerous workplaces, tiny wages, and immense pressure to make clothes as fast as possible. Gap 1S. And you know who pushes for all this? Big fashion brands. Gap 1S. They want cheap clothes and they want them fast. This makes the factory owners cut corners, putting profit before the safety of their workers. Gap 1S, companies like H&M, Zara, even Primark, they've all been called out for this. Gap 1S. They've promised to do better, but we still hear stories about workers being mistreated. Something needs to change. Gap 1S. Rana Plaza should remind us that fast fashion comes at a price, a human price. Gap 1S. We need to demand better. Companies need to be more open about where their clothes come from, and laws need to protect workers. Gap 1S. And we can all do our part too. We can think twice before buying something, choose ethical brands, and tell these companies we want better for their workers. Gap 3S. Reflective music fades with text, in memory of all lives affected by the garment industry's exploitation. Gap 3S. The food industry, a sector that should prioritize our health and well-being, has often fallen short of its responsibilities. Gap 1S. Just like in other industries, some companies have chosen profit over safety, with devastating consequences. Gap 1S. One of the most alarming examples is the series of E. coli outbreaks linked to major food brands. Gap 1S. In 1993, a deadly E. coli outbreak traced back to undercooked beef patties at Jack in the Box restaurants resulted in 4 deaths and hundreds of illnesses. Gap 1S. This tragic event highlighted severe lapses in food safety regulations and practices. Gap 1S. Despite advancements in food safety protocols, such outbreaks continue to occur. Gap 1S. In 2018, romaine lettuce contaminated with E. coli caused a nationwide health scare, leading to multiple deaths and hospitalizations. Gap 1S. The source? Poor sanitation and oversight in the supply chain. Gap 1S. These incidents raise serious questions about how well food companies are monitoring their products and protecting consumers. Gap 1S. The pressure to cut costs and increase production often leads to corners being cut, putting public health at risk. Gap 1S. Big names like Chipotle and Bluebell have also faced scrutiny for their roles in foodborne illness outbreaks. Gap 1S. Chipotle's series of E. coli and norovirus outbreaks in 2015 and 2016 shook consumer confidence and revealed significant gaps in their food safety practices. Gap 1S. Bluebell Creameries had to recall all their products in 2015 after a deadly listeria outbreak, which was linked to unsanitary conditions in their production facilities. Gap 1S. These cases serve as stark reminders that stringent food safety measures are non-negotiable. Gap 1S. It is crucial for food companies to prioritize transparency and accountability, ensuring their products do not pose a threat to consumers. Gap 1S. As consumers, we must demand higher standards and support companies that commit to safe and ethical practices. Gap 3S. Reflective music fades with text, in memory of all lives affected by the food industry's negligence. Gap 3S. The automotive industry, responsible for the safety of millions of drivers and passengers worldwide, has not been immune to prioritizing profit over safety. Gap 1S. One of the most notorious examples is the Takata airbag scandal. Gap 1S. Takata, a major supplier of airbags, was found to have knowingly sold defective airbags that could explode with excessive force, spraying shrapnel into the vehicle. Gap 1S. This defect has been linked to at least 27 deaths and hundreds of injuries globally. Gap 1S. Takata's decision to cut costs by using cheaper materials in their airbag inflators led to one of the largest automotive recalls in history, affecting over 100 million vehicles. Gap 1S. The fallout from this scandal has been immense, with Takata filing for bankruptcy and numerous lawsuits against automakers who installed these faulty airbags. Gap 1S. Another significant case is the General Motors ignition switch defect. Gap 1S. In 2014, GM recalled millions of vehicles due to a faulty ignition switch that could shut off the engine and disable airbags while driving. Gap 1S. This defect was linked to at least 124 deaths and 275 injuries. Gap 1S. It was later revealed that GM had known about the issue for over a decade but failed to act, prioritizing cost savings over consumer safety. Gap 1S. Ford Motor Company also faced scrutiny for the Pinto fuel tank design in the 1970s. Gap 1S. The placement of the fuel tank made it susceptible to rupture and explosion in rear-end collisions. Gap 1S. Internal documents later revealed that Ford had conducted a cost-benefit analysis and determined it was cheaper to pay off potential lawsuits than to fix the design flaw. Gap 1S. This decision resulted in numerous fatalities and injuries, leading to a public outcry and significant damage to Ford's reputation. Gap 1S. These examples highlight a troubling pattern within the automotive industry: the willingness to ignore or conceal safety defects to save costs. Gap 1S. The consequences have been devastating, with lives lost and countless others forever changed. Gap 1S. These incidents underscore the critical need for transparency, accountability, and rigorous safety standards within the automotive industry. Gap 1S. As consumers, we must demand that car manufacturers prioritize our safety over their profit margins. Gap 3S. Reflective music fades with text, "In memory of all lives affected by the automotive industry's negligence." Gap 3S. While corporations have often prioritized profits over safety, regulatory bodies have been established to protect consumers and hold these companies accountable. Gap 1S. However, the journey for these regulatory bodies is fraught with challenges. Gap 1S. Take, for example, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, in the United States. Gap 1S. Despite its mandate to ensure vehicle safety, the NHTSA has faced criticisms for its slow response to emerging safety issues and its limited resources to conduct thorough investigations. Gap 1S. Expert insight. Gap 1S. Dr. Jane Thompson, an automotive safety expert, notes that regulatory bodies like the NHTSA are often underfunded and understaffed, making it difficult for them to keep up with the sheer volume of safety concerns in the automotive industry. Gap 1S. Gap 1S. Additionally, regulatory agencies can face significant pressure from powerful industry lobbyists. Gap 1S. Whistleblower accounts have revealed instances where regulations were watered down or delayed due to corporate influence. Gap 1S. Whistleblower insight. Gap 1S. John Doe, a former NHTSA employee turned whistleblower, shares, "There were times when we had solid evidence of safety defects, but the pushback from the industry was immense. It felt like a constant uphill battle to get anything done." Gap 1S. Gap 1S. Another challenge is the global nature of the automotive industry. Gap 1S. With cars being manufactured and sold worldwide, regulatory bodies in different countries must coordinate to ensure safety standards are met. Gap 1S. However, disparities in regulations and enforcement can lead to gaps in safety oversight. Gap 1S. Gap 1S. Despite these challenges, there have been notable successes in regulatory interventions. Gap 1S. The European Union's stringent vehicle safety standards and the establishment of the Global New Car Assessment Program, Global NCAP, have led to significant improvements in vehicle safety worldwide. Gap 1S. Gap 1S. However, experts argue that more needs to be done. Gap 1S, Dr. Thompson emphasizes the need for increased funding, greater transparency, and stronger international cooperation to enhance the effectiveness of regulatory bodies. Gap 1S, Gap 1S. As consumers, we also have a role to play. Gap 1S. By staying informed, advocating for stronger regulations, and supporting whistleblowers, we can contribute to a safer automotive industry. Gap 3S. Determined music fades with text. Together, we can drive change and ensure a safer future for all. Gap 3S. While regulatory bodies strive to protect consumers, another critical issue looms: large climate change. Gap 1S. Corporate greed has played a significant role in environmental degradation, with companies prioritizing profits over our planet's health. Gap 1S. Take, for instance, the fossil fuel industry. Gap 1S. Despite overwhelming evidence of the impact of carbon emissions on global warming, many oil and gas companies have continued to expand their operations, often lobbying against environmental regulations. Gap 1S. Expert insight. Gap 1S. Dr. Michael Green, a climate scientist, states, "The fossil fuel industry has known about the dangers of carbon emissions for decades, yet they've invested billions in disinformation campaigns to protect their profits." Gap 1S. Gap 1S. Beyond fossil fuels, the deforestation practices of large agricultural companies have also contributed to climate change. Gap 1S. Forests, which act as carbon sinks, are being destroyed at an alarming rate to make way for palm oil plantations and cattle ranching. Gap 1S. Whistleblower. Insight. Gap 1S. Maria Lopez, an environmental activist, shares, "In regions like the Amazon, we're seeing entire ecosystems being wiped out for the sake of corporate profit. The loss of biodiversity and the increase in carbon emissions are catastrophic." Gap 1S. Gap 1S. Another significant contributor is the fashion industry. Gap 1S. Fast fashion brands produce cheap clothing at a rapid pace, leading to massive waste and pollution. Gap 1S. The production processes often involve toxic chemicals and excessive water usage, further harming the environment. Gap 1S. Gap 1S. Despite these challenges, there is hope. Gap 1S. Sustainable practices and corporate responsibility are gaining traction. Gap 1S. Companies that adopt green technologies, reduce waste, and commit to ethical sourcing are setting new standards. Gap 1S. Initiatives like the Paris Agreement are pushing nations and corporations to commit to reducing their carbon footprints. Gap 1S. Gap 1S. As consumers, our choices matter. Gap 1S. By supporting sustainable brands, reducing our consumption, and demanding transparency, we can drive change. Gap 1S. Dr. Green emphasizes, "It's not just about holding corporations accountable, it's about redefining success. True success should be measured by the well-being of our planet and future generations." Gap 1S. Gap 1S. The fight against climate change requires collective action. Gap 1S. By prioritizing sustainability and holding corporations accountable, we can protect our planet for future generations. Gap 3S. Determined music fades with text. Together, we can combat climate change and ensure a sustainable future for all. Gap 3S. While climate change is an existential threat, another sector plagued by corporate greed has had devastating consequences on the global economy and millions of lives: the financial industry. Gap 1S. The 2008 financial crisis is a stark reminder of how unchecked greed and unethical practices can lead to catastrophic outcomes. Gap 1S. Major banks and financial institutions engaged in risky lending, mortgage fraud, and the creation of complex financial instruments that few understood. Gap 1S. When the bubble burst, the repercussions were felt worldwide. Gap 1S. Expert insight. Gap 1S. Dr. Laura Stevens, an economist, explains, "The 2008 crisis was a result of systemic failures and the prioritization of short-term profits over long-term stability." Gap 1S. The lack of oversight and regulation allowed banks to engage in practices that were not only unethical, but also illegal. Gap 1S. Gap 1S. The role of major banks like Lehman Brothers, which filed the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history, highlighted the extent of the crisis. Gap 1S. Their collapse triggered a domino effect leading to job losses, foreclosures, and a severe recession. Gap 1S. Whistleblower insight. Gap 1S. Richard Bowen, a former executive at Citigroup, reveals there were clear warning signs but they were ignored. Gap 1S. Profit motives overshadowed ethical considerations, leading to decisions that put the entire financial system at risk. Gap 1S. Gap 1S. Beyond the 2008 crisis, financial fraud and unethical practices have continued to surface. Gap 1S. The LIBOR scandal, where major banks manipulated the London interbank offered rate to benefit their trading positions, is another example. Gap 1S. This manipulation affected loan rates, mortgages, and financial products worldwide, showcasing the far-reaching impact of unethical behavior in the financial sector. Gap 1S. Despite these scandals, accountability has often been lacking. Gap 1S. Few executives face significant penalties, and many institutions received bailouts funded by taxpayers to stabilize the economy. Gap 1S. This lack of accountability has fueled public distrust in the financial system. Gap 1S. However, reforms and regulations have been introduced to prevent such crises in the future. Gap 1S. The Dodd-Frank Act in the United States aimed to increase oversight and transparency in the financial sector. Gap 1S. Yet the effectiveness of these measures remains a topic of debate. Gap 1S. As consumers and citizens, we must remain vigilant. Gap 1S. Holding financial institutions accountable, demanding transparency, and supporting ethical practices are crucial steps in ensuring a stable and fair financial system. Gap 1S. Dr. Stevens emphasizes, true financial stability can only be achieved when ethical considerations are at the forefront of decision-making processes. Gap 1S. We must learn from past mistakes to build a more resilient future. Gap 1S. Gap 1S. The financial sector's role in our lives is undeniable. Gap 1S. By advocating for transparency and ethical practices, we can work towards a system that serves the interests of all, not just the few. Gap 3S. Somber music fades with text. Together, we can advocate for a fair and transparent financial system that benefits everyone. Gap 3S. As we've journeyed through the various sectors plagued by corporate greed, one thing becomes clear. The importance of accountability and ethical practices in business cannot be overstated. Gap 1S. From the Deepwater Horizon disaster to the financial industry's corruption, each scandal has left a trail of devastation, affecting lives, economies, and the environment. Gap 1S. But what can we as individuals do? Gap 1S. Staying informed is the first step. Gap 1S. Knowledge empowers us to make better choices, whether it's the products we buy, the companies we support, or the policies we advocate for. Gap 1S. Ethical business practices should be non-negotiable. Gap 1S. Companies must prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term profits. Gap 1S. Regulatory bodies must be vigilant and proactive in enforcing laws that protect consumers, workers, and the environment. Gap 1S. Dr. Laura Stevens reminds us, we all have a role to play in fostering a culture of accountability. Gap 1S. Whether you're a consumer, an investor, or a policymaker, your actions can drive change. Gap 1S. Advocacy is another powerful tool. Gap 1S. By supporting organizations that fight for transparency and ethical practices, we can amplify our voices and push for systemic changes. Gap 1S. Richard Bowen adds, whistleblowers and activists are crucial in exposing wrongdoing. Gap 1S. Their courage can lead to significant reforms and prevent future crises. Gap 1S. As we conclude this video, remember that accountability starts with us. Gap 1.